And so anyway, so working primarily in the city of San Francisco, doing a lot of these projects as an architect, you almost by necessity learn a lot about local policy. So you have to learn about zoning, you have to learn about how to get a building permit through the building department, you have to learn about design review, and you have to learn about all of these different both state and local laws that can impact your ability to do what someone's paying you for, which is get something built. One thing that I don't know how many folks in this class might have an architecture background, but for architects and designers, a lot of the actual like project management of interfacing with the city to get through all of those steps is actually managed by an architect or by their firm. You don't have a big developer somewhere. You don't have a team of lawyers. You don't have a bigger team of anyone. It's just the architects and their junior designers doing all of that project management work. And so through that part of the process, I got more and more and more interested and invested in sort of this like urban policy, housing policy element of why is it so inconsistent that San Francisco as a city, and I'm sure you could use LA as a corollary, says out of one side of their mouth that they care a lot about density, that they care a lot about housing affordability, that they care a lot about housing opportunity in that urban environment. And yet, either formally or informally, their laws and processes are set up in a way that's exactly opposite that. And what would need to happen in order for that to change? Does this mean that you need to go lobby the Board of Supervisors? Does this mean that you just need to get really, really good at slithering through the building department and getting your permits in the best way? Is there a lot of organizing that needs to occur? Is it more a matter of education and making sure that elected officials really like know the consequences of their actions that might be well-intentioned but not play out in practice? And so through this process, I kind of started to get more and more and more involved in activism, actually, and sort of having that perspective as a practitioner. I could actually go to a lot of local activists and local organizers and other advocates in City Hall and say like, look, you know, they have this policy and really it's actually making it harder to build housing, or actually this is like not working out the way that people assume that it will, and making sure that there's that really strong line of communication between people who are on the receiving end of the policy and people who are writing or forming or negotiating that policy at a high abstract level. Obviously in housing, it's not just architects and designers that are on the receiving end, it's also the eventual residents of that housing, the eventual residents of that neighborhood, the people who may or may not have the opportunity or ability to live in a certain neighborhood. So I don't want to communicate that it's just that one sector, but that is a part of it. And so kind of through probably over the course of maybe a year and a half, I was doing architectural design work, slowly getting more and more involved in this permitting and city focus process, and then also moonlighting as a community organizer, trying to agitate for and educate folks on exactly how we could push for smarter policies that did the things that we wanted to see in the city. Through that, I basically got to the point where I knew that I wanted to move to a bigger architecture firm, more for boring like licensing reasons, in order to finish my apprenticeship. And right at the moment that I was about to quit my job, look for jobs at a bigger firm, maybe work on my portfolio, I got a call from a then supervisor in City Hall who had this weird opening in his office for a legislative aide who was focused on housing. Their current staffer was out on parental leave, and they were able to hire someone as like a temp almost for that 4 or 5 month period for an extended parental leave. And it was interesting because their criteria was like, you can learn the politics, but we really need someone who knows their way around the planning and building department, and who's sort of aligned with a lot of the goals that we're trying to push forward on the work that we're doing. And so from, again, this kind of unconventional position, I knew very little about city politics than a lot of people who fall into that role normally, or work their way into that normally. But I knew my way around the building department, planning department. I could really talk confidently about stuff that was happening on the ground with neighbors, with new development, having been doing that work as an architect. So I ended up getting hired for that job. At the time, I was probably like 23, 24. I was really broke and trying to figure out how to save money to like find my way into another architecture job afterwards. And was planning on just saving a little bit of money. So I had a little more freedom at the end of that and ended up never leaving. So that supervisor was Scott Wiener, who's now in the state Senate. That next fall, he ended up getting elected to Sacramento, and there was an opportunity to stay in his office should he win that election, and kind of be one of his housing deputies, to which, I had kind of nothing to lose. I was, like I said, 24, 25 at this point, and really eager to push forward on a lot of this work that I had kind of, from a very different background, felt like I was actually scratching the itch of what got me into architecture, much more working in policy than I ever did designing bathroom details or fighting with building inspectors or a lot of the other stuff that you do as a young junior architect. And so I ended up, on 6 days notice, moving to Sacramento, getting settled in my office in the Capitol. Had very little experience in politics specifically at that point, but that's something that you can learn. And being able to talk credibly as a practitioner, as someone trained in the specific field that, like I said, is on the receiving end of the policies that are passed, is something that is extraordinarily valuable and something that is very much lacking in a lot of policymaking roles. Even the people who are writing a lot of these, for example, state laws on housing, on land use, on environmental law, up at the state level, I knew probably maybe one or two of my hundreds of colleagues who were trained as planners, or as people who'd had experience being practitioners in that area, or even like schooling in that capacity. And so I say this partly just for folks in this class who might be interested in pushing forward with jobs or roles, either in city government, in state government. I know less about the federal government, but I assume there would be somewhat of a corollary there, that if you, would be interested in not just being a professional on the receiving end of the laws that affect your field, but actually being one of the thinkers, one of the staffers, one of the people negotiating that set of lines, there's a huge shortage of people with that type of specialty doing that work. I found, at least in my experience working in the Capitol for 4 years, that most of my colleagues, some of them had masters of public administration. Very few went to law school. A lot of them were like political science undergrads and just always wanted to work in politics. And there's certainly a need for that. But when it comes to, do you have a backing either based on real life experience or schooling or professional work or your own like lived life experience, in a way that is impacted by these laws that are being passed, there's so much value in that. And so I want to make sure that folks aren't steered away based on sort of like high level ideas of who the normal profile of a person is in a lot of those jobs, because I think the normal profile is really lacking, and a lot of the flaws that we see in our laws and legislation today can be directly related back to the fact that the people writing and negotiating those laws are often not representative of the people impacted by them, either professionally or otherwise. So starting out, I don't want to take up too much more time because I know Pavo's got questions, but my very first year in the state legislature was the year that we passed SB1, which was a massive 50-something billion transportation package. That was the biggest infrastructure bill that had been on in California in decades. We also did the 2017 housing package, which I'm sure has somewhat been talked about or will be talked about in this class. The bill that I staffed in that package was SB 35, that I think we might talk about later in the class. But that was like my very first day at work in the Capitol. That was like, okay, here's your project for the year. Like, let's go. That bill has actually successfully built like thousands, if not tens of thousands of affordable units throughout the state of California, just in the few years that it's been active, which was really gratifying. And we also renewed the cap and trade program. There was a lot going on. And I mostly say this to just show that a lot of being in this type of job has to do with like really learning on the job, kind of almost an apprenticeship model. And the more exposure you have to more ways that things can successfully get done, the better off that you are. And so it was really interesting being in the legislature at the time that I was, because there was so much really high impact legislation coming out in quick succession, to really see all the different styles of how do laws get passed? How do laws get negotiated? What are the problems that they can see? Who are the people impacted by that? How do we course correct when we find out when those problems occur? And how do we monitor implementation after the fact? So I ended up staying 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. So basically my boss's full first term. I could go through the laundry list of stuff that we did that was related to housing, but I'll hold off for now. And yeah, that's a little bit about, I guess, background and, career path. I'd also be happy to answer questions for anyone if as you're figuring out your way during and through grad school. I'll put my email in the chat, but I'm also always more than happy to talk with folks, especially people who are interested in doing stuff in planning or at that policy intersection of planning.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so I was, the main thing I would love to hear about is how a bill becomes a law, and kind of a little bit about the calendar year of legislation in the state of California, and kind of how things eventually become laws.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
so I will. Yeah, I'll answer to the best of my ability, and if I get too off track, let me know. Because there's a lot of sort of mechanical procedural things that have to do with like how a bill becomes the law in terms of the legislative calendar and who are all the parties involved and sort of what are those hard and fast requirements. And then there's a lot of sort of institutional knowledge about just like, you could do it any one of 10 ways on paper, but what are the most successful ways of getting things done? So the high level structurally is that in California, at least, and some states are different, so I'll speak only about California in this case, just because that's where my experience is. The legislative session is 2 years long. So for example, right now we're in the first year of a 2-year session, and then there's the second year of a 2-year session is sort of the lingo people use. So 2017 and 2018 were one session, 2019 and 2020, and then 21 is sort of the first year moving forward. We have a full-time legislature, which is rare compared to a lot of different states in the US. In a lot of states, it's like you have part-time people who work for 4 months of the year in their legislature, and then they go back to their normal job. We have a full-time legislature. Our session for each of those 2 years runs from either December to August or January to September, and it kind of alternates year by year. So it's a pretty significant chunk of the year. 75% of the year, you are actively like on 10-minute turnaround deadlines, doing committee hearings every week, having floor session. And then there's 3 months of the year where you're kind of almost more like, the best comparison that I have for the fall in the legislature as a staffer is it feels a little bit what I imagine grad school would feel like, where you're doing a lot of research. You're doing a lot of outreach to experts. You're doing a lot of interviewing. You're basically saying, here's some policy ideas that we've identified or policy problems that we've identified that we anticipate wanting to pursue with a bill next year. But we really need to learn more about this landscape, about who the stakeholders are, about what the experts in the space are saying, about assessing really how big a problem this is, and also what the politics around this problem would be, and sort of doing your risk assessment there about how much you want to take on that next year and how successful you might be. So winter, spring, summer, legislative session, fall is recess between those 2 years. Basically, the course of the year, oh, sorry, go ahead, Pavo.
I just have to get my daughter's getting home. I'm going to go open the door.
Okay, I'll keep going. So basically, I think it's good to think about this sort of in like quarters or months, because the rhythm of the year is highly dependent on that path of the bill through the legislature. In California, we have 2 houses. So you have both the Senate and the Assembly. All senators can introduce up to, I think, 20 bills every year, 40 over the 2-year session. Assembly members get 25 every year or 50 through the 2-year session. Every single bill has to proceed through policy committees in the House where the author is from. So a senator goes through the Senate policy committees, Assembly through the Assembly policy committees. It has to proceed through the Appropriations Committee, which is a really sort of like difficult, kind of opaque process. It was established, I think, during the recession in California as a nod to, we don't want to pass laws that we can't afford to implement. But now it's sort of become this super politicized, like if leadership doesn't want a bill to get through, they can just mysteriously kill it and it's no one's fault. And so policy committee, appropriations committee, and then a floor vote. And so you will have certain members of the legislature that are appointed to different policy committees, whether that's the housing committee or the transportation committee or the local government committee. If it passes out of those committees that have roughly 5 to 15 legislators sitting on it, then you do appropriations, you get out if you get out, and then you go to the Senate floor where you have 40 senators voting on it, or the Assembly floor where you have 80 Assembly members voting on it. If you successfully proceed out of those committees. Most bills are a majority vote on the floor. Some of them are a 2/3 vote on the floor, which is sort of a weird thing about California law and wanting the power of the supermajority in our representatives. Then you flip houses. So essentially, like, winter is mostly policy committees. Spring is the chaos of the end of policy committees, and then the deadlines for appropriations, and then the deadlines of floor votes. And then the Assembly and the Senate have the same deadline, usually at the end of May, where every single house has to be off of their floor if it's going to proceed for that year. Then they flip. So all the bills that pass out of the Senate get put on the Assembly's desk. All of the bills that pass out of the Assembly get put on the Senate's desk. And then they just start that exact same process over. So the Senate policy committees throughout the summer hear every single Assembly bill. And then if it proceeds, they hear the appropriations bills. And then if it proceeds, they get through the Senate floor, and vice versa. At the end of the summer, there is a period of time. It's usually like everyone's up, all the staffers are up until like 3 or 4 a.m. It's a midnight deadline. All the legislators kind of play sausage making with each other's like, well, I'll only take your bill up for a vote if you take our favorite bill up for a vote. So everything gets jammed to the end of the night. And then the governor has, I think it's like 2 weeks or 4 weeks to decide whether to sign or veto those bills. And so you can actually realistically get all the way through the legislature, and then it gets put on the governor's desk and he vetoes it, or she vetoes it, which is something that we've seen happen with a number of bills for a number of different reasons. So that's kind of the high level of the process of how a bill works in terms of the timing and the structure of sort of who's has power over it or is voting on it at every moment in time. One nuance that is also important or kind of interesting is that if you make it to the second house, so if a Senate bill makes it all the way to the Assembly, and then there's a lot of like political fights over a bill, or like the people who are responsible for advocating for it get less interested, or any of those different things, you can actually put a bill on hold once it's in the second house for an entire year. So it is very likely that we will see over the course of this summer a bunch of Senate and Assembly bills that get held, and then they basically become a 2-year bill, and they will not come back up for a vote until next summer when we get to the same part of the process again. It's somewhat common. It's something that I've seen a lot of times because like there's something active happening in like current events or organizing or something with the advocates responsible for pushing something forward, where they all of a sudden have very different priorities. And so they put that bill on hold because they don't have the resources to adequately push for it. When it goes to the process from a staffer's point of view of like how you do that job successfully, I'll kind of maybe describe this, if this sounds good, Pavo, with like sort of what your workload as a staffer looks like through all of those processes. So like I said, in the fall, you're mostly doing a lot of research, you're doing a lot of outreach, you're convening a lot of meetings with, you know, dozens of advocates and other legislators in some cases on how are we going to tackle this problem. And ultimately the end goal of that exercise is that you as a staffer draft up either a rough version of a bill or an outline of a bill, and you send it to this department in the state called Legislative Counsel, which is essentially the attorneys for your part of government. So I'm not an attorney by background, but I can write my non-attorney version of the bill and they can clean it up for me. And then that bill has to be introduced by January or February to the public. And so nothing is public until you introduce it. So all of that work happening behind the scenes is happening for 3, 4, 5 months until the public actually gets to see it in most cases. And so you'll often see, like, you know, in the news or on Twitter or however you sort of follow stuff about the legislature, all of a sudden there's 1 month where all these bills get introduced. Those are all the product of 4 or 5 months of staff work that lead up to that moment where it becomes open to the public, oftentimes actually longer. After that, that bill gets referred to different committees. So it goes through this process through the Rules Committee, where they say, hey, this is a housing bill, it's going to Housing Committee. This is a bill about zoning, and so it's going to go both to the Local Government Committee and the Housing Committee. This is a bill about environmental review, and so it's going to go both to the CEQA Committee and the Housing Committee, et cetera. And then you go through those policy committees. And as a staffer, you're helping count votes. You're helping write the presentations for those bills. You're helping line up advocates who are going to testify in support of your bill. And you're also actively meeting with all of the opposition to your bill to make sure that if there's a way to address their concerns that's in alignment with the goals that that you've established as the policy problem you're trying to solve, that you can take amendments for the opposition. And so oftentimes as a staffer, you're inviting in people who don't like your bill and you're saying, hey, how can we play ball with each other? Like, is there a way that I can address your concern and make you feel better about this bill, or get your organization on board or get your community more comfortable with this? And what changes would you need in order for that to happen? And so this is also part of the process where I often had a lot of frustration as a staffer that there weren't that many people who were actually connected to either the communities that they were trying to negotiate with or the interests that they were trying to answer to, and really be able to kind of like call bullshit when some interest was actually being co-opted for something else, or in other cases, highlight opposition that actually was merited, right? Like, oh, this is actually a real problem that we didn't foresee, but now someone has brought it to our attention and we need to focus a lot of energy and attention on this. Absent sort of your own independent judgment, it ends up just being the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? And so whoever whines the hardest or throws the biggest hit or goes to the press ends up getting the attention, which I would argue is not really how we should be doing policy necessarily, in a lot of cases. But that's what ends up happening. So a lot of housing bills, for example, get really watered down because, in my opinion, like rich exclusionary NIMBYs throw a fit, and it's not really a lot of, I'm reading the chat right now. It's popping up. And there are a lot of people who just try to address those concerns as opposed to say, hey, this actually completely waters down the bill and the goals of our bill, and it will be rendered completely unusable or unhelpful if we actually take a lot of the advice or recommendations that you're offering. So basically that whole process is arguably like 6 months or so through all the policy committees in both houses and up to the Senate floor. You're doing a combination, like I said, of vote counting, of assisting with communications and press, of negotiating amendments and advising the legislator who you're working for on whether something is worthy of their attention or not, or whether it's something that they should, like I said, kind of play ball with. If it's a worthwhile compromise to make, you have to understand both the policy and the politics of every decision that you make and sort of what you're taking on by making that decision. And then as you get to the end of the year, it just kind of becomes more and more and more urgent and real. Towards the last probably couple months, you end up starting to meet with the governor's office and the departments that will be responsible for implementing your bill. And so laws, of course, don't just stop with the legislature. Once they're done with the legislature and they're signed, then they actually have to be used, right? And so you usually have a department responsible for writing all the regulations around it, or an enforcement agency responsible for setting themselves up to enforce it and create staff members for that. And so oftentimes in those last couple months, the department, so usually it was in my case, HCD, Housing and Community Development, or OPR, the Office of Planning and Research, would come to us and say, here's actually some amendments coming to the government from another part of government that's responsible for implementing it. And if you're successful in getting the sort of political and policy goals with the final version of this, can you make these tweaks or adjustments or changes that will make it possible for us to implement that bill? So we either need this to be a little more objective, a little more subjective. We need that language to be a little clearer. We need it more explicit what we're responsible for and what we're not responsible for. We would like the language in this bill to conform with the language that's used in other bills that has the same exact goal, so that we can go through the regulations writing process easier. So that's kind of also an interesting process because you get an eye into how people in other parts of government that are not legislating look at laws as they come through, and what the life of that law is going to be after it's out of your hands. Because when you're done in the legislature, the second that the governor signs your bill, if you don't ever want to think about that bill again, you don't have to. I would argue good legislators do track their bills and make sure they're being implemented correctly and clean them up as following years goes on, but you have no responsibility to. And so ultimately it's in the hands of those departments. And so you want to make sure that you're collaborating freely with them. So I think that that's probably a good point to stop in terms of like what the actual structural process looks like, as well as what it's like to be a staffer through all of that. Pavo, I don't know if you saw any gaps or if you want to move on to
No,
anything
it's
else.
super interesting. That was awesome, and I think it sounds really exciting and stressful. I had in my notes. I had another question. It was like, why don't we get more legislation passed in this state? There's so many obvious things we could do to make the state better, but now I think you answered that question by explaining how complicated it is, and
I would also,
everybody.
yeah, I would also just add that I think that like there is something to be said for blaming, a lot of the just sort of like institutionalized and cultural and political like powers that be that have been built over the course of many, 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 many decades, often more than half a century, as often barriers in getting good policy passed. And no one staffer is going to be able to singularly overcome those, right? I think some other things that often come up as like, why can't, like, I have an idea for a policy, why can't we pass it tomorrow? There are legally some constitutional barriers. And so, for example, if there's ever been a state ballot prop passed, whether it's Prop 13 or, different ones that have come through, Prop 13 is usually the one people talk about. You cannot override that at the legislature. It has to be only overridden at the ballot. And so a lot of legislators have their hands tied. They're legally not allowed to do certain things through the legislature, even if everyone today in 2021 would agree that it's a good idea. You have to have the actual voters give you permission to do that. And the other thing that I'll say, which is a little bit more of a like wholesome and maybe slightly naive, though it worked for me, is I think that there's a lot to be said also for like educating potential opposition about really what's driving you towards making that policy change. Politics is generally a very, very, very low trust environment, especially on something as contentious as housing and land use. And I often had a lot of success by like, going to people and being really straight with them and just being like, look, this is what we're trying to achieve. This is what we're not trying to achieve. And like, if you have conspiracy theories about it, I'm giving you my word and I will take amendments that, make you have more trust and faith in me. But also, here's realistically what's likely to happen if this passes. And I think that there's a lot of education that can be done for folks who are skeptical about the sort of like hypothetical abstract outcome of something versus this is actually what's likely or realistically going to happen. And if you don't trust me, what protections or parameters can we put in place? Because that's really all that we care about. And sometimes that actually works. And that's actually something that I find if you come from, again, either like living in a community or having an academic or professional background or something that gives you a little bit more credibility in that topic area. I think that there's a lot to be said for leaning on like, hey, we're not trying to screw you over. Like, how can we make this work for you and like kill the conspiracy theories around this policy? And so I think that like, a lot of folks in policymaking, to be totally honest, are like too lazy to do that education and outreach. And it really shows because a lot of their work ends up getting pushed around a lot more aggressively than folks who are willing to put that time in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that question of how much work you're willing to do in order to move something forward seems super important. And it seems like from a legislator's perspective, they have an agenda of things they want to achieve. They have to allocate their time to things, and to get something through is going to take so much work that I mean, it seems like maybe we need more legislators or something. I don't know. I have so many questions that I want you to talk about. Maybe, but I want to make sure I ask you like this kind of zoning reform. I mean, because Scott has done a lot of work on zoning reform that you've helped him do, and so I think maybe if you can tell us like the two paths, like the SB 50 path versus the housing law RENA path. And so we've talked about the housing law and forcing cities to add space for housing in the way that they want within certain parameters versus, I don't think we've actually talked about SB 50, but I assume everybody knows about it in this class, versus the state saying, no, these are the parts of the city that will have more space for housing, right? And so I don't know if that's how you all thought about it as you worked on both of these topics, and what your perspective.
It's a good question. I will set up my answer to this by saying that I think looking at it sequentially in terms of what sort of battles did we decide to take on year by year is an important framing just for the narrative of like how a lot of these policies came to be. So we did SB 35 my very first year in the legislature in 2017. SB 35, for folks who are not familiar with it, essentially says if you are in a city that has a demonstrated housing shortage through their RENA numbers, which is the only tool that we have, however imperfect, to determine whether you have a housing shortage or not. If you have a housing shortage in your city, then the state basically mandates that like there is now a streamlined path for building housing in your city up until you get back on track. So if you're building housing above and beyond at all of the affordability and income levels that are required by the state, and you're meeting all of your quotas, we're not going to take your power away. If you're not, and if you're low performing, then we're going to say, hey, here's a faster, better, sometimes cheaper way to build mostly affordable housing, but some market rate projects or mixed income projects have benefited from this as well. But it has to be zoning compliant, and it can only be in cities where there's a housing shortage. And there were a bunch of these sort of like strings attached that were put in both because it was good policy and also because of the politics around getting a bill like that passed and what precedent it set. And it was informed by both, again, good policy and also the politics of getting it through. So at the end of SB 35, there were a ton of criticisms, a ton of opposition. Most of them have been proven out as false, frankly, since, and a lot of people who were critical of it at the time have taken back their critiques. However, two of the critiques that were very, very valid from SB 35 were SB 35 just reinforces shitty zoning because every project has to be zoning compliant. And so if you have a city that has really, really inequitable zoning, leading to patterns of segregation that aren't adequately taking advantage of public transit infrastructure, all these different things, SB 35 arguably reinforced it because it said, we're just going to make it easier to build according to that shitty zoning. That was a fair critique. Another one is that RENA is a horrible system historically, and it was not at all tied to reality. And the only mark of which, are you in a housing shortage or not, was garbage and kind of unenforceable and not rooted in truth about any stretch of the imagination of housing supply. And so we came back the next year and said, okay, building on the success of SB 35, how do we address the very real critiques to make SB 35 arguably a better, stronger policy, more in line with our broader goals around housing? And so we came back that next year with a bill that was focused on fixing RENA, which actually Pava was a really strong advisor to us in as we were writing it. And also a bill that addressed a lot of the zoning issues, particularly around how we don't allow for apartment buildings near public transit in most parts of California. And so zoning reform and then also RENA reform were the focus coming out of SB 35. SB 828, the RENA bill, ended up passing successfully, I think largely because people didn't realize how big a deal it was going to be because it's implemented over the course of the next decade. The other bill, the zoning reform bill, was not successful. It was highly, highly, highly contentious. SB 827, if folks were following that period of time in housing Twitter and housing activism and the news, and we were not successful. And we still thought that zoning reform was an important tool to move forward with. And so we came back the next year, at the first year of a 2-year session, and tried to have a more tactical, refined, nuanced version of SB 827 that had a stronger focus on also building in exclusionary high opportunity areas where there's good jobs, good schools, good air quality. We had a lot more of a local control element for cities that knew they had to build by transit but wanted to sort of do it more their way. We had stronger anti-displacement and anti-demolition protections because there's not uniform protections across the state. And so we didn't want there to be an unfair playing field for certain parts of the state in terms of how people or communities could be exploited through that. And so I think that like comparing, should it be SB 50 or should it be SB 828? It's kind of interesting because at the time, we didn't think we were picking one or the other. We were really just trying to improve on the shortcomings of SB 35. I think in reality, to answer your question in a succinct way, really the difference between the SB 50 approach of zoning reform and the housing element and RENA approach of zoning reform is how much faith do you have in both the local governments and also the state's administrative capacity? And I mean that by saying that the RENA and housing element approach is far less politically fraught. It arguably could be more nuanced to the needs of certain communities and the policy goals of certain communities within those parameters. But the only way it's successful is if your local government is genuinely trying to play ball with it and shares the same goals and is coming at it earnestly. And also if the state's administrative departments under the executive branch through HCD, which is essentially the bureaucratic state, has the staffing and resources to adequately be a partner in that part of the process. SB 50 bypassed the local governments and also bypassed that state bureaucracy because we knew that they were poorly funded and poorly staffed and poorly resourced. And SB 828 and the RENA and housing element approach very much takes, I don't think I should say takes for granted, but it very much says this is only going to work, and we know this is only going to work if locals don't spend every last penny they have on attorneys to get around this law, and also if HCD is adequately staffed to call out when an attorney is playing funny business with their housing element. And that is to be seen how that plays out. I don't think it will play out perfectly. I think there will be a lot of loopholes in the housing element law now that it really matters. And I think that we're already starting to see in Southern California and in the Bay Area the different games that cities are planning to play. The cool thing about this, however, is that some of the reforms that were passed through RENA, they actually can be much more meaningful, and that we don't just have you need to build it with development patterns that are under certain air quality goals, but also you need to have fair housing analyses to make sure that you're not dumping all of your density in low income areas while leaving exclusionary low density areas completely intact. And there's a lot of work, and I think like not just reflection, but actual action that could be taken in a nuanced way that's aligned with the state's policy goals if they do it well. And that's a big if, and it also costs the cities and the state an excruciating amount of money to do that well. And we have very poorly funded local governments and a state government that has a million priorities. So again, I'm hoping for the best and preparing for the worst on that front. The one cool thing I will say about the RENA approach is that it is tied into this feedback loop with SB 35. And so RENA, as you all probably know, is not just the process of getting your housing quotas or your housing supply goals, but also zoning for them. And now we've added this third element, which is regardless of your zoning, if you are not actually building, regardless of your zoning, in accordance with your RENA numbers, you get by right development, you get streamlined development, you get a lot of these benefits that essentially help people build faster in your community in alignment with other goals that were established in that bill in 2017. And I think that that feedback loop of accountability and also like having teeth and enforcement around RENA is going to be really critical for, even if the housing element process does not go perfectly, in 4 years, we will still have a reckoning because there will be a ton of streamlined development and the cities know that that's coming.
Fantastic. Thanks. Man, it's already 12:15. If you can stay for another 10 minutes or so, Annie.
That's fine.
Great.
I'm also, folks, putting my personal email in the chat if anyone has questions they want to follow up with over there.
Thank you. So I guess if people have to leave, you can sign off, but hopefully you can stay. Because I wanted to make sure I asked you about politics, like interest groups in the state. I mean, it's obviously so much of this stuff happens behind the scenes, and something is proposed at the beginning of the session, and then everyone's arguing about it in ways we don't know about ever, perhaps. So maybe if you can just like briefly describe, I don't know, maybe pick one of the things you worked on and who were the main opponents, or if you maybe, or like, you still, I'm sure, know everything that's happening in the state capitol, maybe talk about something that's happening now and kind of how we should think about it. Environmental groups, labor,
yeah,
different advocacy groups, and who has power.
Yeah, I actually think it might be good actually for me to use SB 35 as an example, even though it's from a few years ago, just because that was one that ultimately happened successfully. And I think that like everyone under the sun who could have an opinion on that bill did have an opinion on that bill in housing world. So SB 35 took projects out of CEQA, took projects out of discretionary review, put affordability requirements on them, put demolition restrictions on properties, and also held local governments to account because it said you're no longer allowed to delay projects willy-nilly. There are a lot of different pieces in that are triggers for a lot of different groups. So I'll go through them one by one. The biggest players, I would say, politically in housing who have a lot of power. And again, I say this from the perspective of working for a legislator from San Francisco, right? So who has power in terms of stopping your bill also has to do with who else is in the legislature and who your boss or the legislator cares about being on a good side of and also being on a bad side of. So with that disclaimer, I would say that the construction labor unions are a big one. I would say that environmental organizations are a big one. People who build affordable housing are a big one, and very separate from that interest group, people who work in tenant organizing, anti-displacement work, anti-gentrification. And to be very clear, affordable housing is not one coalition. There are developers and then there are community organizers, and they're often not aligned with each other. So affordable housing is often used to conflate the two when they're very different. And then you also have kind of the broader like market rate developers, traditional business interests, general folks like in the private sector who in one way or another are going to make or lose money based on that policy. And then you have local governments. So those are like the city councils. I would often lump in like the homeowners associations and neighborhood groups and people with like informal power over their city councils, but local government broadly. So when it came to SB 35, labor unions were very, very straightforward in what they wanted. They wanted to make sure that if they were losing their tools for negotiating union wages on development projects, they wanted to be guaranteed union wages and development projects outright, because their argument was, you can't take away our negotiating ability and therefore make it such that we never have any ability to get union wages on these projects. You need to build it into the policy that if you take advantage of this benefit, then we're automatically guaranteed those wages so that we don't have to negotiate. And to be totally frank, like the second that change was put into the policy, they were pretty fine. They were supporters of the bill. There was a little bit of kerfuffle around like what exactly what they're asking for that applies well in all cases. And so the labor language in SB 35 is like 19 tiers of it, but it got worked out and there was no issue after that. The environmental groups were really difficult because we were taking housing development projects out of CEQA, which is the state's environmental law, which is not just how everyone uses to negotiate and appeal development projects, but particularly on environmental grounds about like where we should and shouldn't be doing development. And if something slips through the cracks of the letter of the law, this is a whole judicial process to stop a development or change a development and compel changes. The environmental groups ultimately on SB 35, very reluctantly, we did not get them 1,000,000% on board, but they were willing to take the pulling housing projects out of CEQA if the project was compliant with existing zoning, because that meant it had already gone through environmental review at the zoning phase. And so that project was anticipated in some way on that site. We made it such that they could only be built on urban infill sites. So no like building way out in the green fields, no paving over green protected land or park area. So it had to be on an urban infill site. And we also took away a lot of parking requirements and put certain like transit proximity requirements and everything in there to essentially get at the broader like climate change goals that environmental groups have. And then we had a ton of other restrictions on the sites that were possible to build on that essentially were at large a proxy for taking it out of CEQA. So similar to if you take the ability for labor unions to negotiate out, you need to give them what they would have been negotiating for. Same for the environmental. If you take the ability for environmental organizations to negotiate on a one-off basis for every project, you need to give them what they would probably be negotiating for, which is low VMT development, urban infill sites, no endangered species habitats, no, all these different types of things that are important. And so those were just automatic exemptions that were objective, black and white. You can check yes, check no, and that's the only process that is required. And we were cautious in developing that list with the environmental groups because it seemed worthwhile to, and it was also politically necessary to get that bill through. Next, I would say the affordable housing builders were frankly like the most enthusiastic supporters of SB 35 because it essentially made it overnight from affordable housing projects being the absolute hardest projects to both finance and get through land use and entitlements for in all corners of the state to in 97% of California jurisdictions, they're guaranteed an approval in 60 days. And so just for scale, I got some data from one of the big California low-income housing developers a few years after SB 35. Their average project time, because of fighting NIMBYs and land use fights, went from 9 years for an affordable housing project to 60 days for a project of equal size. And that was through one bill. And so all's to say, like, affordable housing developers from the get-go saw that, and they were extraordinarily supportive of the bill because they are the ones who are honestly having the hardest time fighting NIMBYs in places where they want to build but are having trouble from a land use entitlement perspective. The market rate housing builders were lukewarm. I always thought it was funny that the discourse around SB 35 was that it was like a giveaway to the market rate developers, because like a lot of them didn't even support the bill because they didn't like the precedent of having guaranteed union wages on development projects. It made stuff more expensive for them. That's the traditional like boss worker dynamic, is the private developer versus the construction worker. And so some market rate developers were supportive, some of them opposed it, some of them were lukewarm. They liked the fact that this was voluntary. And so if SB 35 made sense for them to do, they could choose to do it. If it didn't make sense for them to do, it was not a mandatory requirement. It was just an, if you want this incentive, then you have to meet these requirements. And I would also put like landlords and the realtors kind of in that bucket of market rate folks, because they're all kind of invested in that same orbit. And then the anti-displacement and anti-gentrification coalitions and organizers, that was a trickier one. I think by the end, we were able to get some lukewarm support from folks, some flat out support, and we maintained some opposition even at the very end. The changes that we made throughout the course of the bill to ensure that their concerns were addressed as best as we could was we put a restriction so that you could not do an SB 35 on any property that had an Ellis Act eviction recorded, to sort of disincentivize speculation and flipping of buildings with the goal of using SB 35 to streamline the development moving forward. And we also, I believe, put the strongest anti-displacement and anti-demolition protection that at that time existed in any state law in California, and has now become the new gold standard for streamlining laws, which is really cool to say that, you know, we had sort of negotiated that, and it's touching a lot of other parts of the law, which is if there is any tenant who has lived on that property in the last 10 years, you automatically can't do SB 35. And so the goal of that is to make sure that not only are people not buying up occupied properties, immediately evicting everyone, demolishing the property, and then doing a big development on top of that and creating a lot of displacement and instability in the community among the tenants who had no say over this, but also making it such that there's a 10-year look back, such that there's a very strong disincentive against someone buying up a property, emptying it out, and then just waiting a year. And saying, oh, when I applied for this, there were no tenants living in it. And so if you outright say that that's illegal, then you have a strong disincentive, and it's not worth it financially for a developer to just sit on a property for 10 years. And so they just won't flip those properties where there are tenants, which was ultimately the goal. We also put strong inclusionary housing requirements in all SB 35 projects. And that was also in collaboration with a lot of folks, both in the organizing space as well as in the affordable housing space, to say that if you have an inclusionary housing ordinance, it's going to be honored. And if you don't, we will establish one for SB 35 projects, which was really, really strong and cool for the folks who value inclusionary housing a lot in their organizing capacity. So I think that that's, and then the local governments just hated it all the way through. Because ultimately, like, there were some big cities that have bigger housing challenges that I think realized that there is a role for the state to play in making the politics around the local politics around housing less toxic, because if they can blame the state, then it's not their fault as city council members. And there are some cities that saw that and realized that and said, hey, like, we'd love for you to take this out of control, because like the worst thing that we have to do is vote every single week on these really controversial projects where we're politically disincentivized against voting the right way, because all the NIMBYs will organize to vote us out. But most city councils were very, very, very oppositional to it. They were very tied in with the neighborhood associations in the communities where they represented. And also a lot of city council members, like, especially in smaller cities, which is the vast majority of communities in California, a lot of city council members got into office because they wanted to have a role in shaping and negotiating development in their community. And so you say to a city council, hey, we know that's why you got on the city council, but we're actually going to take that power away from you. That is a tough one to swallow. And it fed a lot of conspiracy theories about like what's next, like what is this setting the precedent for in California if we all of a sudden normalize that the state can establish non-discretionary decision making over a city about development happening in that city. So that's, I would say, probably like the biggest kind of like players politically in terms of like when you're doing a housing supply or land use bill, those are the folks that you anticipate will get actively involved and opine and be have a seat at the table no matter what.
Perfect. Thank you. More questions. I have more questions students have. It's 12:30 though. We got to let everyone go. Can you answer? I think the inclusionary zoning is too big of a topic, but maybe quickly Alex's question about why is the housing committee the landlord and homeowner committee?
That's a very good question. So the honest but also horrible answer is that committee members are assigned by the president of the Senate. So if you can think, I mean, in California, they're a Democrat, but imagine the role that we think of like Mitch McConnell having in the Congress. We call them the pro tem, but they're the president of the Senate. And they are responsible for appointing committees as well as fundraising for their Democratic caucus. So if you ever have a legislator who is like being challenged by a Republican or an incumbent who's being challenged by someone, it's actually that Democratic caucus's responsibility to, or informally, they see it as their responsibility to like essentially help defend their Democratic seats, right? In this kind of like broader turf war. And so like implicitly, a lot of committee appointments, to be totally honest, end up being like, hey, apartment association, hey, realtors, hey, local government, hey, labor union, like any of these players that I mentioned who are relevant to the housing conversation, they want their allies on that committee. And oftentimes like you don't really like buy a seat on a committee, but it's sort of implicit that like people who are big donors will get more favorable committee assignments with their allies. It's not formal. It's never something that like people talk explicitly about, but it's sort of known. I will also say honestly that like the legislature overall is very oriented towards landlords and homeowners. We only have, last I checked, like one, maybe two renters in the entire legislature. I think that changed, maybe added like one or two in this last November, but tiny, tiny, tiny percentage. Many of them are landlords. Like the California legislature is quite conservative on a lot of issues. And so I would actually say that more than anything, the housing committee is representative of the legislature broadly, and the legislature broadly is very oriented towards landlords and homeowners. And it's actually quite rare to have legislators who are very, very pro-tenant, who are very pro-renter, who are anti-exclusion. And actually, when you look at really where they put their power and their votes, not just what they say on their press releases, those committees are unfortunately really representative. And so I think that that also just highlights the power of doing a lot of electoral organizing before elections, and not just in places like San Francisco and Oakland and Los Angeles that are already majority renter, but also in places where that is not as, guaranteed a fate, that you're probably likely to have a more pro-tenant legislator because their constituents are more tenants. And also doing organizing in the Central Valley and in, Riverside County and San Bernardino and other places that are by nature a bit more conservative, and also where tenants are structurally much more disempowered than they are in San Francisco or Los Angeles or Oakland or other areas.
Thank you. And I guess we have to end, but I really appreciate it, Annie. This is super great information for all of us, me included.
Yeah, totally. I'm glad I could help. Yeah, thanks everyone for the questions, and you've got a great professor. I wish I could take his class.